The sun bled its last light over a land that held no mercy. It was a country of sharp edges, jagged mountains that clawed at the sky, deserts that stretched into forever under a relentless sun, and forests so deep and dark a person could vanish between one breath and the next. This was America in the raw, a place where the line between civilization and the savage wild was drawn not on maps, but in the hearts of those who dared to cross it. On the ragged fringes of a fledgling frontier town, a silence had fallen, a silence heavier than the summer heat. A young woman was gone. She had walked out from the rough-hewn walls of her family's homestead to collect herbs, a simple, everyday task, and simply never returned. For 3 days, search parties of grim-faced men had scoured the nearby woods, their calls growing more desperate with each passing hour. They found nothing but a single, torn piece of calico fabric snagged on a thorn bush, a silent scream against the green. Hope, like water in a dry creek bed, had seeped away. The preacher had already begun to offer words of comfort for a soul presumed lost. In the eyes of the settlement, she was a ghost, another name to be whispered in cautionary tales about the unforgiving land. But far from the settlers' despair, in the high, lonely places where the eagle rode the wind, a different set of eyes watched the land. He was a warrior of the Apache, a man whose name was spoken with respect among his people, a shadow who moved with the silence of the dawn. He had seen the commotion from a distance, the strange, frantic movements of the men in their stiff clothes. Curiosity, a sense of the balance of things being disturbed, had drawn him closer. He found the trail not where the settlers had looked, but beyond in a rocky gully they had dismissed. He read the story in the dust, a scramble, a fall, the hesitant, limping track of someone badly hurt and profoundly lost, leading away from safety and deeper into the throat of the wilderness. He stood for a long moment, considering. This was not his people's trouble. These newcomers with their plows and their fences brought nothing but conflict. To walk away would be the wise choice, the safe choice. Yet, as the stars pricked the velvet black of the night, he found himself kneeling by the faint trail, his fingers tracing the impression of a small boothill in the soft earth. He thought not of settlers or enemies, but of a simple, human truth. A person was alone, afraid, and dying out there under the same cold moon that watched over his own family. His code, the deep, unspoken law of his being, would not let him turn his back. With a resolve that settled in him like stone, he made his decision. He would go where the search parties would not, could not, venture. He would face the deep wild to find what they had already given up for dead. Meanwhile, deep in a labyrinth of canyon and scrub, the young woman fought a quieter battle. Every breath was a fire in her side, her ankle swollen and useless beneath her torn dress. Thirst was a constant, screaming companion. The vast American sky, which had once seemed so grand from her cabin window, now felt like a crushing dome of indifference. The howls of coyotes were no longer distant sounds, but intimate threats in the dark. She had tried to stay put, to make a shelter, but the gnawing fear and the need for water had driven her to crawl, then to hobble, dragging herself further into the maze. She was a flickering candle in a great, windy darkness, and the flame was guttering out. On the morning of the 4th day, as she lay half-conscious in the scant shade of a rock, she heard a new sound. Not the scuttle of lizards or the call of birds, but the steady, soft crunch of a footfall on gravel. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Was it a bear, a mountain lion, or something worse? Summoning the last dregs of her strength, she tried to push herself back, to hide, but the movement sent a bolt of agony through her leg, and she cried out, a small, broken sound that seemed to hang in the dry air. The footsteps stopped. A profound silence followed, more terrifying than any noise. Then a figure stepped into view, blocking the sun. He was like no man she had ever seen. He was not one of the settlers from the town. He stood tall, his face etched with the same stern lines as the canyon walls, his eyes dark and missing nothing. He wore the clothes of the land itself, buckskin and woven fiber, and in his hand he carried a bow, a tool of death that looked as natural as an extension of his arm. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. Every story she'd ever heard around the hearth, every whispered tale of raids and savagery, flooded her mind. This was the nightmare made flesh. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the end. But the end did not come. Instead, she heard a soft rustle and then the sound of water. Cautiously, she opened her eyes. He had not come closer. He had crouched several paces away, his expression unreadable. From a pouch at his side, he had produced a small water skin and placed it on a flat stone between them. He gestured to it, then to her, his movements slow and deliberate. He said nothing, confusion warred with her primal fear. This was a trick, it had to be. Yet the promise of water was a torment she could no longer bear. With a trembling hand she reached out, her eyes locked on his, and pulled the skin toward her. The water was the sweetest thing she had ever tasted. He did not try to help her up, he did not speak. He simply watched, a silent, powerful presence as she drank. When she was done, he nodded once, then stood and surveyed the canyon around them. He pointed to her injured leg, then to the high canyon rim, then back to her. The message was clear and utterly daunting. The way out was long, and she could not walk it. He then pointed to himself, and with a final, piercing look, he turned and began to climb a narrow, sheer path she had not even seen, a path that led up the cliff face. Within moments he was gone, vanished into the rock as if he had never been. She was alone again, the water skin in her hand the only proof he had been real. Had he abandoned her? Had he gone to get others? Or was this some cruel game, leaving her with a flicker of hope only to snuff it out later? The sun climbed higher, the canyon heating up like a forge. She had no choice but to wait, her fate now utterly tied to the return of a man she had been taught to fear, a warrior whose reasons were as mysterious and deep as the wild country itself. The waiting was its own kind of terror, each minute stretching out, each rustle of wind sounding like a returning step. She was found, but she was not saved. Not yet. The most dangerous part of the journey was still to come. The silence he left behind was worse than before. It was a listening silence, filled with the pounding of her own heart and the slow, thirsty whisper of the wind through the canyon. The woman clutched the empty water skin, the leather now warm from her hands. It felt like a talisman, a thing from two different worlds that had somehow met here in this desperate place. She stared at the spot where the warrior had vanished, the sheer rock face offering no clue, no path her eyes could follow. Had he truly gone for help, or had she just been marked by a predator who was in no hurry? The stories from the settlement were loud in her head now, tales told in low voices by firelight about swift raids and terrible vengeance. But those stories never spoke of a man who gave water and then disappeared. Her thoughts, fuzzy with pain and thirst, drifted back. It was a strange time to remember, but the memory came anyway, sharp and clear. She saw her father's hands, rough and knotted from work, pointing to a line on a poorly drawn map. "This is where we will make our stand," he'd said, his voice full of a hope that felt brittle now. "Good soil, they say a new start." Her mother had been quiet, her eyes always on the horizon, as if she could see the ghosts of what was to come. Their journey west had been a long ache of fear and wonder, the endless, rolling grass, the monstrous mountains, and then this hard, beautiful, punishing country. They'd built their cabin with blistered hands, believing their fences could hold back the wild. She had learned to watch the sky for weather, the trees for game, but she had not learned to read the land itself, not the way that man had. He moved through it like he was part of it, like the rock and the sage knew him. She was just a thing that had stumbled in, a broken bird in a hawk's domain. The sun marched across the sky, and the shadow of the canyon wall slowly crept toward her, a blessedly cool tide. As the fear settled into a steady, exhausting hum, other things came into focus. The careful way he had placed the water between them, a space that was neither a threat nor a promise, but a choice. The absence of any leer or cruel curiosity in his eyes, only a flat, assessing look. The same look she'd given an injured fox once, deciding what to do. He hadn't touched her. In her world, if a man found a woman in distress, he would swoop in, take charge, talk constantly of rescue. This man had done none of that. He had seen a problem, offered the first necessary thing, and then left to solve the rest in his own way. It was unnerving. It made her feel like a task, not a person. And yet, was that not better than the other possibilities? Just as the coolness of the shade touched her torn dress, a small cascade of pebbles clattered down from above. She flinched, her body screaming in protest as she tried to shrink against the rock. He was there again, as silent as a cloud passing over the sun. This time he carried a long, straight branch of juniper, stripped of its twigs, and a bundle of what looked like rawhide strips. He also had 2 more water skins slung across his chest. He approached, still with that deliberate slowness, and again stopped a few paces away. He set the branch down, laid the strips beside it, and placed one of the full water skins next to the empty one. He pointed to her injured ankle, then to the branch, then mimed the act of wrapping. He wanted her to splint her own leg. A flash of something like anger cut through her fear. She was exhausted, broken, and he expected her to do this work. But as she met his gaze, she understood. This was not cruelty. This was another kind of test, another space placed between them. He would provide the tools, but he would not presume to lay hands on her. The dignity in that, the raw, strange respect, left her breathless. With clumsy, shaking fingers, she took the branch and the strips. The pain was blinding as she tried to position the wood alongside her swollen ankle, but she bit her lip until she tasted blood, refusing to cry out in front of him. She fumbled with the rawhide, her hands weak. He watched, never moving to help, his face an impassive mask. Finally, after what felt like an hour, she managed a clumsy, unstable knot. It would have to do. He gave a single, slow nod. Then he turned his back to her and crouched down, looking out over the canyon. He remained that way for a full minute. The message was unmistakable. He was offering to carry her, but he would not look at her while she made the decision, while she made the climb onto his back. It was the only way out. The canyon was a stone prison, and the path he had taken was impossible for her alone. Terror washed over her again, cold and slick. To put herself so completely in the power of this stranger, to be carried off into the wilderness by a man her people considered a devil of the desert. Every instinct screamed against it. But the other instinct, the one deeper and older, was the will to live. It was a quiet voice, but it was steady. It had kept her crawling for water. It had made her drink the water he offered. It spoke now. She looked at his back, the muscles tense under the buckskin, the long black hair tied back. He was a doorway, and on the other side was either death or life. There was no middle ground anymore. With a groan that was part pain, part surrender, she pushed herself up onto her good leg. Hopping once, she nearly fell, the world tilting. In an instant he was up, his arm shooting out to steady her, his grip like iron on her elbow. It was the first time he had touched her. His hand was warm and rough, and he released her the moment she was balanced, as if her skin had burned him. He said nothing, just crouched again, waiting. This time she did not hesitate. She looped the water skins over her neck, then leaned into him, draping her arms over his shoulders. He hooked his arms under her knees and rose in one smooth, powerful motion. He was solid as an oak, and for a dizzying moment she felt a shocking, unwanted sense of safety. He did not jostle her. He adjusted his stance minutely, finding her center of gravity, and then he moved toward the cliff wall. The path was not a path at all. It was a series of cracks and narrow ledges, invisible from below. He climbed with the surety of a spider, his feet finding purchase where she saw only smooth rock. She buried her face against the rough buckskin of his shoulder, unable to watch the drop that yawned beneath them. She could feel the coiled strength in him, the focus so absolute it was like a physical force. He did not breathe hard. He did not slip. He simply ascended, leaving the canyon floor behind. When the ground leveled out, she dared to look. They were on the rim, and the world opened up in a vast, breathtaking panorama of rolling hills, distant mesas, and endless sky. It was a beauty so immense it hurt. He did not pause to admire it. He set off at a ground-eating walk, his pace steady and relentless. He followed no trail she could see, but seemed to navigate by the shape of the hills, the position of the sun, the way the wind bent the grass. Hours bled together. The sun began to sink, painting the sky in colors of fire and ash. He had not spoken a single word. The only sounds were the whisper of his footsteps through the dry grass, the call of distant birds, and the ragged sound of her own breathing. Who was he? Why was he doing this? The question swirled in her mind, a frantic counterpoint to the rhythm of his walk. Was he taking her to his people? What would they do with her? The unknown future was a cliffhanger more terrifying than the physical one she had just escaped. As twilight deepened into a velvet blue, he finally stopped near a small, rocky outcrop that offered some shelter from the wind. He lowered her gently onto a bed of soft, dry pine needles that had collected in a hollow. He moved away, gathering dry sticks and tinder with an efficiency that spoke of a lifetime of such evenings. Within minutes, a small, smokeless fire bloomed in a ring of stones he arranged. He drew a strip of dried meat from his pouch and offered it to her, then took a similar piece for himself. They ate in silence, the fire casting dancing shadows on his stern face. Finally he spoke. His voice was low, gravelly from disuse, and the words were in his own language, a fluid, clicking sound that held no meaning for her. But he was not speaking to her. He was looking past the fire into the growing darkness, and his tone was one of announcement or perhaps explanation. He finished and fell silent again, his eyes now on the flames. He had told the night who she was or what he was doing. He had acknowledged the spirits of this place. It was a reminder that she was in a world governed by rules she did not know, protected by a man whose motives were still a profound mystery. The fire was a tiny island of light in an ocean of dark, unknown country. He had saved her from the canyon, but she was more lost now than ever before. She was in his world, and as she watched him stare into the flames, his profile like something carved from bronze, she knew the real journey was just beginning. The settlement, her family, the life she knew, it all felt like a dream fading away. Out here, under a blanket of cold stars, there was only the warrior, the wild, and a long, dangerous path that led toward a horizon she could not yet see. The fire popped, sending a spiral of sparks up into the vast, star-pricked blackness. The sound was small, but in the immense quiet it felt like a shout. The woman pulled the thin wool blanket she had been carrying in her apron pocket tighter around her shoulders, a meager shield against the desert night's chill and the strangeness of her situation. She watched the warrior across the flames. He had not looked at her since his quiet words to the darkness. He sat perfectly still, his eyes not on the fire, but on the land beyond its glow, listening to things she could not hear. He was a man made of patience, a trait as foreign to her as his language. Her people were always doing, building, talking, filling the silence. He seemed to draw strength from the emptiness. "Thank you," she said, her voice a dry rustle in her throat. The words felt foolish, inadequate for the debt that was piling up between them. He gave no sign of hearing her. Perhaps he did not understand. She tried again, gesturing to her splinted leg, then to him, and putting a hand over her heart. "You helped me." His eyes flicked toward her for just an instant, a glint of firelight in the dark. He said nothing, but gave a single, brief nod. It was not an acceptance of thanks, she felt, but a simple acknowledgement that she had made a sound. The silence stretched again, but it was different now. A line had been crossed. She had spoken, and he had, in his way, responded. "My family," she ventured, the words tumbling out with a sudden urgency. "They will be looking. They think I'm dead," she mimed, searching, a look of despair on her face, then pointed back in the direction she thought they had come from, though she was utterly turned around. This time he studied her for a longer moment. His face was unreadable, but a slight tightening around his eyes betrayed a thought, a calculation. He pointed a stick into the fire, stirring the embers. Then he drew a line in the dirt between them. On one side he placed a small stone. He pointed from her to the stone, "Your people." He then pointed to a spot far down the line, and with a swift, sweeping motion of his hand, he erased a section of it. He looked at her, his meaning clear. The way back was broken, gone, it could not be traveled. Her heart sank like a stone in a well. "What do you mean?" She whispered, though she understood perfectly. The land itself was against them. Perhaps the search parties had stirred up trouble. Perhaps other warriors were watching the trails. The reason didn't matter. The fact was the fact. The path home was closed. He then pointed to himself, then to a different direction, leading away from the line into the blank, unwritten dirt. This way, it was not an invitation. It was a statement of reality. He had a destination, and she, now, was part of his journey. The finality of it stole her breath. She was not being rescued and returned. She was being taken. A cold fear, different from the fear of the canyon, settled into her bones. This was the conflict at the heart of it all, laid bare in the dirt. Two worlds had collided in her broken body, and his world was the stronger. She was caught in the current of his purpose, and she had no idea where it led. Miles away, in the settlement, the conflict wore a different face. The woman's father stood on the porch of their cabin, his hands gripping the rough rail until the splinters bit into his palms. The official search had been called off at dusk. The men were needed for the harvest, for the never-ending work of survival. The preacher's words about God's will had left a bitter taste in his mouth. His wife sat inside by the cold hearth, her face pale and tearless, staring at nothing. But the father was not a man who accepted will, divine or otherwise. A stubborn, furious hope still burned in him. He had seen the tracks the others dismissed, the single set leading away, the peculiar deep scar in the earth near the thorn bush that spoke of a fall, not an attack. He'd kept quiet about it. He knew the talk. Some of the men were already muttering about hostiles, about revenge raids. That kind of talk led to rash actions, to wagons rolling out with rifles, to more blood soaking into the soil. He had a different thought, one born of lonely nights hunting in the woods back east. He knew men could get turned around, could walk in circles for days. He also knew, from grim-faced trappers who passed through, that the Apache sometimes took captives. The thought made his blood run cold, but it was a threat of possibility, however terrible. He couldn't rally the men. They would go as a war party, and that would doom any chance for his daughter if she was still alive. As the moon rose, he made his decision. He would not wait. He would go alone. He took his rifle, a pack with a little food, and a heart full of a dread that was sharper than sorrow. He slipped out the back, past the sleeping dog, and melted into the tree line. He was one man against the savage wild, driven by a love that was as much a part of him as his own breath. His path was a desperate arrow shot into the dark, aimed at a target he could not see. Back at the outcrop, the warrior rose. He kicked dirt over the fire, plunging them into a darkness that was immediately alive with a million stars. He came to her side and once again crouched, his back offered. The time for rest was over. They would travel by night. She understood why. The desert day was a furnace, and they needed cover. But moving under this immense starlit sky made her feel exposed in a new way, a tiny speck in a vast, ancient story. He walked with the same surety as before, a shadow among shadows. The landscape changed, becoming rougher, a series of rolling hills that gave way to broken country littered with boulders and stands of twisted pine. Her mind, unable to settle, churned with questions. She thought of his people. What would they do when he brought a white woman into their camp? Would she be a prisoner, a slave, a curiosity? The stories from the settlement were vague and horrifying on this point. But the man who carried her, whose breath steamed in the cool air, had shown neither cruelty nor kindness, only a stark, practical mercy. He had shared his water, his food, the warmth of his fire. He had not harmed her. This contradiction was a knot she could not untie. As a faint, gray pre-dawn light began to bleed into the eastern sky, he stopped near a fast-running stream cutting through a shallow ravine. He let her drink, then motioned for her to stay, pointing to a dense thicket of willow. He disappeared upstream, silent as a ghost. She waited, the cold seeping into her. This was it, she thought. He had brought her to water and left her. Perhaps this was his solution, to leave her alive, but far from her people, a problem set aside. The loneliness that thought brought was more crushing than any canyon. But he returned, not with a weapon, but with a bundle of moist, dark green leaves in his hand. He knelt before her, and for the first time, he reached for her without the barrier of her initiating it. His fingers were deft and surprisingly gentle as he untied her clumsy splint. Her ankle was an ugly mess of purple and yellow. He examined it, his touch clinical, then began to crush the leaves between his palms, releasing a sharp, clean scent. He applied the poultice to the swollen flesh, the coolness and immediate relief, and rebound the splint with fresh, expert raps. His head was bent in concentration, and in that moment he was not a warrior of a feared nation, but simply a man with a skill, tending to an injury. The act was so human, so devoid of the savage wild she had imagined, that it broke something open inside her. "Why?" she asked softly as he finished tying the last knot. Why are you doing this? He sat back on his heels, wiping his hands on his leggings. He looked at her, really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time as a person who asked questions, not just a burden to be carried. He seemed to search for words she might understand. He pointed to her, then touched 2 fingers to his own eyes, then swept his hand out toward the rising sun washing over the cliffs. I see you. Then he clenched his fist and held it against his chest. My duty, or perhaps my choice? It was not an answer, not really, but it was a truth. He had seen her, and he had chosen this path. Before she could process it, his head snapped up, his body going rigid. His eyes narrowed, scanning the rim of the ravine. All the softness vanished, replaced by the alert tension of a hunter. He placed a hand over her mouth, a swift, silencing gesture, his other hand going to the knife at his belt. He listened, his every muscle coiled. Then, from far too close, came a sound that froze her blood. Not the cry of an animal, but the distinct metallic click of a rifle's hammer being cocked. The sound came from the rocks above them. They were not alone, and whoever was there was not a friend. The warrior's body shielded hers, his back to the threat, his face a mask of grim resolve. The conflict was no longer about 2 worlds or a journey. It was here, now, in this ravine, and it was armed. Time stopped, measured only by the frantic drum of her heart against her ribs. The warrior did not move. He was a statue of tension, his hands still pressed lightly over her mouth, his body a solid wall between her and the sound from the rocks. His eyes were fixed on a point above them, calculating. The gentle morning sounds of the stream and the waking birds had vanished, swallowed by a silence that was heavy and waiting. A voice called out, rough with strain and exhaustion, "You there!" "Apache, step away from her." The words were English. It was a man from the settlement. Her breath hitched, a surge of wild, disorienting hope flooding her. They had found her. But the hope curdled instantly as she felt the warrior's stillness turn to something else, a readiness that was more dangerous than any movement. He slowly, deliberately removed his hand from her mouth. He did not step away. He shifted his weight, just enough to place himself more squarely as a shield. "I said step away!" The voice shouted again, closer now. There was a tremor in it, a blend of fear and fury. "I've got a bead on you. Let her go." She could see him now, a figure emerging from behind a slab of sandstone on the ravine's rim. It was her neighbor, a man who had helped raise the beams of their cabin. His face was gaunt, etched with 3 days of desperate searching, and his rifle was leveled shakily at the warrior's back. His eyes were wide, seeing only the nightmare story he had been told, a savage, a captive white woman. He did not see the carefully wrapped splint, the shared campsite, the protective stance. "Mister," she croaked, her voice weak from disuse. "Wait." But her voice was too small. The neighbor's finger was white on the trigger. "It's all right," he called to her, not taking his eyes off the warrior. "I'm here now." "You're safe." The warrior spoke then, his voice a low, steady rumble, directed not at the man with the gun, but at her. He said a single word in his language, a command. It meant down. Before she could react, the crack of the rifle split the morning air. The sound was monstrous in the confined space of the ravine. At the same instant the warrior moved. He did not dive for cover. He threw himself backwards, knocking her sideways into the shallow water at the stream's edge, his own body covering hers. The shot echoed off the stone walls, and she heard a sickening thud as the bullet struck the dirt where they had just been kneeling. The cold water shocked her system. She gasped, tangled in his limbs, her splinted legs screaming in protest. Above them, the neighbor was fumbling, cursing, trying to reload his muzzle loader. The warrior was already rolling off her, coming up into a crouch, his knife now gleaming in his hand. His eyes were locked on the man on the rim, not with rage, but with a cold, deadly focus. He could have thrown the knife. He could have scrambled up the rocks and closed the distance in the time it took to reload, but he did not. He stayed between her and the threat, a silent, formidable barrier. "Don't!" she screamed, the word tearing from her throat. She struggled to sit up in the water, holding a hand out toward her neighbor. "He saved me. He's helping me." The neighbor paused, the ramrod halfway down the barrel of his rifle. His eyes darted from her desperate face to the Apache warrior, who stood poised like a mountain cat, ready to spring but holding back. Confusion warred with the ingrained fear on the man's face. He's got you?" the man stammered. "He's taking you. He found me when you all gave up," she cried, the truth of it sharp and clear. "He gave me water. He fixed my leg. He was taking me—" She trailed off. Where was he taking her? She didn't know. The admission hung in the air, weakening her plea. The warrior, sensing the shift, slowly straightened from his crouch. He did not sheathe his knife, but he lowered it to his side. He spoke, a short, sharp phrase to the man on the ridge, then pointed to the woman in the water, and made the same sweeping gesture he had made in the dirt. The path was gone. He was not the enemy here. The land was, but the neighbor's world was simple. His rifle was loaded again. He raised it, the barrel wavering between the warrior and the space near him. The standoff was fragile, a hair trigger of misunderstanding about to snap. One wrong move, one twitch, and the ravine would become a grave. Then a new sound. Not a gunshot, but a high, piercing whistle that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. It was a bird call, but too perfect, too repeated. The warrior's head jerked up, his eyes scanning the opposite rim of the ravine. A look of profound alarm crossed his features for the first time. He uttered a low, harsh word under his breath. From behind other rocks, 2 more figures rose. They were not settlers. They were Apache warriors, younger, their faces painted with stark lines of ochre and black. They held bows, arrows nocked and drawn, aimed not at the white man with the rifle, but at their own kinsmen standing in the stream. Their expressions were not of rescue, but of cold accusation. The woman felt the world tilt. The simple conflict of captive and rescuer shattered into a dozen dangerous pieces. The young warrior who had saved her was now surrounded, caught between the settler's gun and the arrows of his own people. He had broken some law, some taboo. By helping her, by leaving his intended path, by being seen with a white woman, he had drawn this down upon them all. One of the new warriors shouted, his voice commanding. The warrior beside her shook his head once, a sharp, defiant gesture. He spoke back, his tone firm, gesturing to her. He was explaining, arguing. The bows did not waver. The settler, now terrified and utterly out of his depth, kept his rifle pointed, his eyes wild as he looked from one group to the other. The leader of the new warriors barked an order. He pointed at the woman, then at the ground at his feet. The command was clear. Leave her. Walk away. Come with us. The warrior who had carried her through the night looked at her. In his eyes she saw the calculation return, but it was fused now with a frustration so deep it looked like pain. He had faced the savage wild for her. He had faced a settler's bullet. Now he faced the judgment of his own world. To stay with her was to invite death from 3 directions. To obey his people was to abandon her to a man with a shaking gun and no understanding of the desert, which would be a slower death sentence. The tension in the ravine was a physical thing, a wire stretched to singing tautness. The settler's finger hovered over the trigger, the bowstrings were pulled tight. Her fate, and the fate of the man who had chosen to save her, hung suspended in the thin, high-altitude air. No one moved, no one breathed. They were a tableau of fear, duty, tradition, and a fragile, unexpected loyalty that had no name. The climax was here, a knot of conflicts pulled so tight it could only be cut by a single, irreversible action. Someone would have to move first. And when they did, the peace of the mountains would be shattered forever. The world held its breath. In that suspended silence, the woman acted not from courage, but from a pure, desperate instinct that cut through the fog of pain and fear. She pushed herself up from the cold stream water, using the warrior's leg for balance. She stood, dripping and shaking, on her good leg, placing herself not behind him, but partly beside him, facing the settler on the rim. "Put the gun down, mister," she said, her voice stronger now, clear and sharp in the quiet. She looked not at the Apache bows, but at her neighbor. "You are going to get us all killed. Look at me. I am standing. He is not holding me. Now, lower that rifle." Her neighbor's eyes, wide with confusion, met hers. He saw the grit in her gaze, the mud on her dress, the expertly wrapped splint on her ankle. He saw she was not cowering. The barrel of his gun dipped, just an inch. It was enough. The warrior beside her understood the shift. Without taking his eyes off his kinsman, he slowly, slowly bent, and placed his knife on the wet stone of the stream bank. It was not a surrender, it was a statement he would not fight. He raised his empty hands, palms open, toward the young warriors on the ridge. He began to speak, his voice low and urgent, weaving a story in the flowing cadence of his language. He spoke of finding a wounded creature, of the duty to a life placed in his path. He spoke of the long journey through the night, of the shared water and the silent understanding. He did not plead. He explained. The leader of the young warriors listened, his bowstring still taut. His eyes flicked to the woman, to the settler now resting his rifle but on the ground, to the knife lying on the rock. The rigid anger in his face softened into a simmering conflict of his own. The rules were clear. Engagement with the settlers brought danger, it blurred lines. But his kinsman had not brought a prisoner of war. He had brought a problem, a broken bird, and he had done so with a respect that was evident in every detail of the scene. Finally, the leader spoke a single, sharp word. He lowered his bow. The other warrior, after a heartbeat, did the same. The immediate threat of arrows was gone, but the air remained thick with unresolved tension. The leader gestured, a quick movement of his chin toward the north. Go. Then he and his companion turned and melted back into the rocks from which they had come, vanishing as swiftly as they had appeared. They had delivered their judgment. He was on his own, his path dishonored, but they would not be the ones to spill his blood over this. The warrior let out a long, slow breath. He picked up his knife and sheathed it. Then he turned to the woman. He pointed to the settler, then to her, then back in the rough direction of the settlement. His meaning was clear, and it held a finality that ached. This is your chance. Go with him. She looked from the weary, frightened face of her neighbor to the impassive, proud face of the man who had carried her from the canyon. The path home was being offered, the one she had longed for, but the journey had changed the map inside her. Going back meant returning to a world that saw this man as a monster, a world that would never understand the quiet dignity of the water skin placed between them, the respectful distance he had kept, the healing leaves he had gathered at dawn. She shook her head. I can't walk, she said to her neighbor, the truth a solid thing, not like this. And she glanced at the warrior, he knows the way through this country. The safe way, she turned back to the warrior. She pointed to him, then to the ground at his feet, and then made a walking motion with her fingers. I will go with you. For the first time, a flicker of something like surprise, and then a deep, grudging respect touched his eyes. He gave a single, firm nod. He then looked up at the settler and pointed decisively north, away from the settlement, then held up 5 fingers. He repeated it. In 5 days, that way. The neighbor understood. He was being given a location, a promise, a trade. He would return alone, without her, and face the music. He would have to tell a story that no one would believe, but he had seen the arrows, seen the woman's defiant stand. He nodded, a short, jerky movement. 5 days, he rasped. He gave the woman one last, long look, a mixture of pity and awe, then shouldered his rifle and turned, scrambling back up the ravine the way he had come, leaving them alone once more. The journey that followed was different. It was not a silent, desperate flight, but a deliberate passage. He moved slightly slower, mindful of her leg. On the second day, they came upon a small band of his people, a family group moving with their horses. There were tense moments, stares hard as flint, but her warrior, she had begun to think of him that way, spoke calmly. He did not present her as a captive or a prize, but as a responsibility he had undertaken. An elder woman, her face a network of wise lines, brought her a bowl of stew and examined her ankle, clucking approvingly at the poultice. It was not welcome exactly, but it was tolerance, a fragile bridge built on his standing. On the morning of the 5th day, they crested a high ridge. Below, cradled in a green valley by a silver river, lay the settlement. It looked small and fragile from this height, a tiny scratch on the immense face of the land. He helped her sit on a sun-warmed rock. He pointed to the valley, then to her. Then he pointed to himself and to the vast, wild country stretching out behind them. His meaning was a question and a choice. Your world or mine? She looked down at the settlement, thinking of her mother's worried face, her father's stubborn love. She thought of fences, of whispered fears, of a life that now felt impossibly narrow. Then she looked at the man beside her. He had faced death in many forms to save her, not because she belonged to him, but because she was a life in need. He had shown her a world where survival was a dance with the land, not a war against it. The savage wild was not a place of mindless cruelty, but of fierce, unwavering laws, where respect was earned not by what you owned, but by how you walked. She placed her hand over her heart, as he had done by the fire. Then she pointed not to the settlement, but to the wild, beautiful, unforgiving country at his back. She would not go back to the old map. She would learn the new one. A slow, deep smile, the first she had ever seen, touched his lips. It was not a smile of triumph, but of understanding. He helped her up, and instead of turning towards the valley, they turned north, walking side by side now. Her pace slow but steady. He did not carry her. She was walking her own path by choice. Weeks later, a party from the settlement, led by her determined father and the chastened neighbor, found the place on the ridge he had been directed to. They found no woman. Instead, arranged carefully on a flat stone, they found her torn calico apron, neatly folded. Beside it lay a single, perfect eagle feather, its tip dipped in ochre. It was not a message of war or theft. It was a story told in objects. She was gone, but she was safe. She was not lost. She was found in a way they could never comprehend. The father picked up the feather, feeling its light strength. He looked out at the endless, rolling wild, and for the first time, his fear of it softened into something else, a mystery and a kind of peace. His daughter was out there, somewhere beyond the savage wild, under the same wide sky, walking a different trail home.